and doubled that of some of them. He likewise openly engaged in a traffic which is discreditable even to a private individual, buying great quantities of goods for the purpose of retailing them again to advantage. Nay, he made no scruple of selling the great offices of the state to candidates, and pardons to persons under prosecution, whether they were innocent or guilty. It is believed that he advanced all the most rapacious among the procurators to higher offices, with the view of squeezing them after they had acquired great wealth. He was commonly said to have used them as sponges, because it was his practice, as we may say, to wet them when dry and squeeze them when wet. It is said that he was naturally extremely covetous, and was upbraided with it by an old herdsman of his, who, upon the emperor's refusing to enfranchise him gratis, which on his advancement he humbly petitioned for, cried out, that the fox changed his hair, but not his nature. On the other hand, some are of opinion that he was urged to his rapacious proceedings by necessity, and the extreme poverty of the treasury and exchequer, of which he took public notice in the beginning of his reign, declaring that no less than 400,000 millions of sesterces were wanting to carry on the government. This is the more likely to be true, because he applied to the best purposes what he procured by bad means. His liberality, however, to all ranks of people was excessive. He made up to several senators the estate required by law to qualify them for that dignity, relieving likewise such men of consular rank as were poor, with a yearly allowance of 500,000 sesterces, and rebuilt, in a better manner than before, several cities in different parts of the empire, which had been damaged by earthquakes or fires. He was a great encourager of learning and the liberal arts. He first granted to the Latin and Greek professors of rhetoric the yearly stipend of 100,000 sesterces each out of the exchequer. He also bought the freedom of superior poets and artists, and gave a noble gratuity to the restorer of the cone of Venus, and to another artist who repaired the Colossus. Someone offering to convey some immense columns into the Capitol at a small expense by a mechanical contrivance, he rewarded him very handsomely for his invention, but would not accept his service, saying, "Suffer me to find maintenance for the poor people." In the games celebrated when the stage scenery of the theatre of Marcellus was repaired, he restored the old musical entertainments. He gave Apollinaris, the tragedian, 400,000 sesterces, and to Terpinus and Diodorus, the harpers, 200,000. To some 100,000, and the least he gave to any of the performers was 40,000, besides many golden crowns. He entertained company constantly at his table, and often in great state, and very sumptuously, in order to promote trade. As in the Saturnalia he made presents to the men which they were to carry away with them, so did he to the women upon the calends of March, notwithstanding which he could not wipe off the disrepute of his former stinginess. The Alexandrians called him constantly Kybiosactes, a name which had been given to one of their kings who was sordidly avaricious. Nay, at his funeral, Favo, the principal mimic, personating him and imitating, as actors do, both his manner of speaking and his gestures, asked aloud of the procurators how much his funeral and the procession would cost, and being answered 10 millions of sesterces, he cried out, "Give him but 100,000 sesterces, and they might throw his body into the Tiber, if they would." He was broad-set, strong-limbed, and his features gave the idea of a man in the act of straining himself. In consequence, one of the city wits, upon the emperor's desiring him to say something droll respecting himself, facetiously answered, "I will, when you have done relieving your bowels." He enjoyed a good state of health, though he used no other means to preserve it than repeated friction, as much as he could bear, on his neck and other parts of his body, in the tennis court attached to the baths, besides fasting 1 day in every month. His method of life was commonly this. After he became emperor, he used to rise very early, often before daybreak. Having read over his letters, and the briefs of all the departments of the government offices, he admitted his friends, and while they were paying him their compliments, he would put on his own shoes and dress himself with his own hands. Then, after the dispatch of such business as was brought before him, he rode out, and afterwards retired to repose, lying on his couch with one of his mistresses, of whom he kept several after the death of Caenis. Coming out of his private apartments, he passed to the bath, and then entered the supper-room. They say he was never more good-humoured and indulgent than at that time, and therefore his attendants always seized that opportunity when they had any favour to ask. At supper, and indeed at other times, he was extremely free and jocose, for he had humour but of a low kind, and he would sometimes use indecent language, such as is addressed to young girls about to be married. Yet there are some things related of him not void of ingenious pleasantry, amongst which are the following. Being once reminded by Mestrius Florus that plaustra was a more proper expression than plostra, he the next day saluted him by the name of Flaurus. A certain lady pretending to be desperately enamoured of him, he was prevailed upon to admit her to his bed, and after he had gratified her desires, he gave her 400,000 sesterces. When his steward desired to know how he would have the sum entered in his accounts, he replied, "For Vespasian's being seduced." He used Greek verses very wittily, speaking of a tall man who had enormous parts, maxi bibas, cradon dolikoscion enkos, still shaking as he strode his vast long spear, and of Cerylus, a freedman, who being very rich had begun to pass himself off as freeborn, to elude the exchequer at his decease, and assumed the name of Laches, he said, O Laches, Laches, epan apothanais authis ex archais esai Kyrilos. Ah, Laches, Laches, when thou art no more, thou'lt Cerylus be called, just as before. He chiefly affected wit upon his own shameful means of raising money, in order to wipe off the odium by some joke, and turn it into ridicule. One of his ministers, who was much in his favour, requesting of him a stewardship for some person, under pretence of being his brother, he deferred granting him his petition, and in the meantime sent for the candidate, and having squeezed out of him as much money as he had agreed to give his friend at court, he appointed him immediately to the office. The minister soon after renewing his application, "You must," said he, "find another brother, for the one you adopted is in truth mine." Suspecting once during a journey that his mule driver had alighted to shoe his mules only in order to have an opportunity for allowing a person they met, who was engaged in a lawsuit, to speak to him, he asked him how much he got for shoeing his mules, and insisted on having a share of the profit. When his son Titus blamed him for even laying a tax upon urine, he applied to his nose a piece of the money he received in the first instalment, and asked him if it stunk, and he replying no, and yet, said he, it is derived from urine. Some deputies having come to acquaint him that a large statue, which would cost a vast sum, was ordered to be erected for him at the public expense, he told them to pay it down immediately, holding out the hollow of his hand, and saying there was a base ready for the statue. Not even when he was under the immediate apprehension and peril of death could he forbear jesting. For when, among other prodigies, the mausoleum of the Caesars suddenly flew open, and a blazing star appeared in the heavens, one of the prodigies, he said, concerned Julia Calvina, who was of the family of Augustus, and the other the king of the Parthians, who wore his hair long. And when his distemper first seized him, I suppose, said he, I shall soon be a god. In his 9th consulship, being seized, while in Campania, with a slight indisposition, and immediately returning to the city, he soon afterwards went thence to Cutilii, and his estates in the country about Reate, where he used constantly to spend the summer. Here, though his disorder much increased, and he injured his bowels by too free use of the cold waters, he nevertheless attended to the dispatch of business, and even gave audience to ambassadors in bed. At last, being taken ill of a diarrhea to such a degree that he was ready to faint, he cried out, "An emperor ought to die standing upright." In endeavouring to rise, he died in the hands of those who were helping him up, upon the 8th of the calends of July, 24th of June, being 69 years, 1 month, and 7 days old. All are agreed that he had such confidence in the calculations on his own nativity, and that of his sons, that after several conspiracies against him, he told the senate that either his sons